Thank you very much to Sven and Hatice and the organizers, to Vita. I actually have a thanks slide at the end, so you're going to get thanks twice. But yes, we're talking about Kant's epistemology of testimony and the problem of persuasion. And I want to emphasize the problem here. If you'll forgive me a moment of intellectual biography, that 2010 paper that Hatice mentioned in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research was actually written in 2002, 2003. That shows you how long it takes to get something published in philosophy. But in that time, I was doing a dissertation in which I was an anti-reductionist, and I guess I was engaging, I think now, in a little bit of motivated reasoning, and I saw Kant as an anti-reductionist fellow traveler. And I no longer think that that's accurate. And so in this paper, I'm trying to reassess the evidence for Kant's anti-reductionism. And so here's what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to start, we've covered a lot of this ground before, so I'll try to go through this quickly. If you want to go to sleep for a little while, the time to really wake up will be in that fourth section. That's where we're going to be looking at the challenges. There's maybe a little bit of new stuff on the prevalence, new for this conference, on the prevalence of dissimulation, persuasion, and cognitive prejudice. And it's sort of a glückliche Fügung, a sort of lucky break that you guys are almost sitting in the correct order for how these sections go. So I'm very thankful to Axel for the first section. I'm thankful to Andrew for the second section, and then I was helped a lot by Hatice's work on working on the third section. And then the mistakes, if there are any, will come in the fourth section, and that's all due to me, right? So the rest of that stuff shouldn't be controversial, but I want to take you through it just so you can see the background of what's going on in that fourth section. Right, so we'll start with Kant's epistemology of testimony, and here's a quote from Gelfand, 2006. He says, Kant devotes ample space to discussions of testimony and, in his lectures on logic, arrives at a distinct and stable philosophical position regarding testimony. Important elements of this position consist in A, acknowledging the inelimitability of testimony, B, realizing that testimony can establish empirical knowledge with certainty, C, establishing a presumptive principle regarding the acceptance of testimony, and D, arguing for a symmetry between knowledge based on experience and knowledge based on testimony. And what I'm going to question here really is the stability of the philosophical position that we're going to see. And in particular, I'm going to highlight that C, the C section, if you'll excuse that terminology here, establishing a presumptive principle regarding the acceptance of testimony. Okay, so Kant's epistemology of testimony, evidence that Kant acknowledges the inelimitability of testimony, and I'll go through this rather quickly because, as I say, you've heard it a lot this weekend. So he says, for example, history and geography are founded on the testimony of other people. And in a lot of these, I'm just giving one citation. There are others that we could give, but again, I'm just trying to review this stuff quickly. He also says, it is true that something that we can learn only from the experience of others through their testimony is a case of historical belief, because for one of those witnesses, it was after all his own experience and a matter of fact, or we presuppose that it was. Right. As far as realizing that testimony can establish empirical knowledge with certainty, he says, for example, by following the path of historical belief, it must always be possible to arrive at knowledge, and hence the objects of history and geography, and everything, whatever, that in view of the character of our cognitive powers, it is at least possible for us to know are not matters of faith, but matters of fact. Right? And here's another quote, I won't even read it. Next, arguing for a symmetry between knowledge based on experience and knowledge based on testimony. Here's a longer quote, right, but the basic idea here, and we've heard it again before, we can just as well accept something on the testimony of others as on our own experience, and then he goes on to say it's just as likely that we're deceived by our own senses as that we're deceived by them, and so on. Right, so again, you've heard all of this before. Here's another one. Okay, the one, again, that I'm going to question, and that's why I've kind of put it out of order here, is the one that we helpfully just saw in Axel's talk before, And this is what Axel, and I'm following him in calling it this, the presumptive principle. And in my 2015 Routledge book on testimony, I actually call the anti-reductionist view, I call it presumptivism. It's a term that I've used myself before. Right. There he says, as for what further concerns the credibility and sincerity of witnesses who communicate experiences they have obtained, everyone is taken to be sincere and upright until the opposite has been proved, namely that he deviates from the truth, etc., according to the well-known principle of fairness, and there's the principle. Okay, so again, brief review. The next step that will hopefully prepare us for the challenges is briefly to review some points having to do with the distinction between rational assent and persuasion. And as I say here, I'm really indebted to Andrew, although as we'll see, I've made a slight modification. I've weakened a condition there just to be even more concessive to Kant rather than less so. So famously, Kant distinguishes between these three sorts of ways of assenting, right? Having an opinion, believing, and knowing. Here's the very long quote, but the take-home message is that these three sort of species are distinguished between by whether subjective grounds or objective grounds or both are present, right? So that's sort of the core idea there. Okay. So what I want to highlight a little bit here are possible scenarios regarding mere belief, right? So these are cases where the subjective grounds are not the same as the objective grounds, right? So that there's a difference there. Right? I think that this is background that might become relevant for the discussion later. So one case is that S is not aware of her subjective grounds, and I hope you'll bear with me here. It's not obvious that Kant allows all of these cases. These might be cases where Kant doesn't even consider them. That's a possibility. This is me just thinking about here are the possible scenarios, and you Kant scholars can tell me, well, Kant wouldn't have countenanced this one, or Kant wouldn't have countenanced that one. Right, so one is that S is not aware of her subjective grounds, but the idea here is she has subjective grounds. She's just not aware of them. Right, so that was the idea that I was thinking there. And again, you might say Kant doesn't account for that. A second case is that S correctly identifies her subjective grounds and recognizes that her subjective grounds are not objective. Right, she has some subjective grounds, but she knows they don't rise to the level of objective grounds. And again, you guys can correct me, but that strikes me as sort of the classic Kant case of belief, right? We have sufficient subjective grounds, but not sufficient objective grounds, and we are aware of both of those facts. Right? Another case is that S correctly identifies her subjective grounds, but mistakenly believes that her subjective grounds are objective, right? And that's the persuasion case. Right? And we're going to come back to that one. And then this one is something that I didn't even find really in Andrew, so this is one that I'm adding here, and that's that S mistakenly takes certain grounds to be the grounds for her belief, but the subjective grounds are different from the ones that she supposes. So she takes something to be her subjective grounds, and she's wrong about that, right? And again, I might not have found it in Andrew because Andrew didn't find it in Kant, right? So this is not a criticism, this is just, I'm trying to sort of open the logical space here and see what our options are. Okay, so to return to this notion of persuasion, persuasion is mere appearance, since the ground of the judgment which lies solely in the subject is held to be objective, right? So that's going to be a key feature that we're going to go back to. Okay, so this is the picture of knowledge then that I'm attributing to Kant. And it's that condition 3.3 that slightly weakens this from Andrew's work. But otherwise, this should be something familiar to you if you've read Andrew's work on this stuff. It's not radical. It's slightly different presentation, but that 3.3 is the key distinction, right? So according to Kant, S knows that P, if and only if P is true, S assents to the truth of P, and there is some ground G such that G is S's sufficient objective ground for assenting to P, and G is S's sufficient subjective ground for assenting to P. So the objective ground and the subjective ground are identical, right? And then this third condition, there is no other ground G prime such that G prime is not equal to G, and S believes G prime to be her sufficient objective ground for assenting to P. So basically, S isn't mistaken about what her objective ground is. Right? That's the sort of ruling out persuasion condition. And if you want to go look at Andrew, you'll see his is a little stronger than mine, but you can take my word for it. It is. I trust my testimony. Okay, so we've covered the first two now. The third section is Kant on the prevalence of dissimulation, persuasion, and cognitive prejudice. Right, so on dissimulation, Kant says, for example, that some people would like to discuss with someone else what they think about their associates, the government, religion, and so forth, but they cannot risk it, partly because the other person, while prudently keeping back his own judgments, might use this to harm them, and partly because, as regards disclosing their faults, the other person may conceal his own, so that he would lose something, or they would lose something of the other's respect by presenting themselves quite candidly to him. Right? So that's one of these ideas that, and I'm also drawing from Alan Wood's 1991 article here, right, that in our interactions with others, we are sort of in the position of this unsocial sociability, right, and that there's a stress here. Right? And here's another quote. A person who notices that someone is observing them and seeks to study them will either appear embarrassed, and then they cannot show themselves as they are, or they will disguise themselves, and then they do not want to be known as they are. Right? Okay, on persuasion, and again, these are just quick quotes. You guys are welcome to push back on me if I've misread something here, but I'm taking this to be sort of uncontroversial text basis, and I'm going through it rather quickly so that we can get to the meat of the discussion, which I think will be the 4 challenges that I want to pose. So on persuasion, first of all, one thing that I want to highlight here is basically opacity, that it's hard for us to judge when we are in the grips of persuasion rather than genuine knowledge, right? And this is also from the introduction to the anthropology, right? It says if he only wants to study himself, then he comes into a critical situation, namely that when what drives him, die Triebfedern, are active, he does not observe himself, and when he observes himself, what drives him is at rest. So we're not aware of the motivations that actually move us, right? And he also says, old and rooted prejudices are admittedly hard to battle because they justify themselves and are, as it were, their own judges, right? So we're not aware when we're in the grips of these aspects of persuasion, right? So these prejudices that he's talking about here, these cognitive prejudices, are forms of persuasion, right? And he considers 3 in particular that he calls the social prejudices. He also has a corresponding, that we've talked about briefly, the logical egoism prejudice, which I don't really discuss because it doesn't relate to this sort of challenge that I want to raise for Kant's epistemology of testimony. But that's the sort of Gegenpol that's there as well. But as far as the social prejudices go, there are 3 of them. The prejudice of prestige of the person, right, that we rely on someone's Ansehung, someone's prestige when we decide whether we want to believe them, and that's actually supposed to be a prejudice, right? We're not behaving rationally when we do that. Also the prejudice of prestige of the multitude, right? Everyone believes it, so I should believe it too. And then prejudice of prestige of the age. And here he doesn't necessarily mean the current age, right? So if you know someone who, I guess in the US, a number of white nationalists are big fans of the Viking era or something like that, right? I guess because they think that Vikings are white nationalists from thousands of years ago or something like that, right? But that would be a form of the prejudice of prestige of the age, right? So they're just relying on the fact that this was done in Viking times, so I should do it too, right? That would be the idea. We're flipping in now. Yes, good. All And the upshot of this for Kant is that many remain with persuasion, some come to reflection, but few to investigation, right? So Kant himself thinks that these problems of persuasion are endemic, that they're very widespread. So it's not that this is a small problem, right, but a big one. Okay, so that brings us to section 4, right? These are the challenges. And I'll try to slow down a little bit and go through these a little more slowly. I've tried to put these in reverse order, actually, of what I personally take to be their seriousness for Kant. So in other words, challenge 1 is, I think, the least problematic for Kant. I think that he probably has the resources to deal with challenge 1. It's also the least systematic. Whereas once you get to challenge 4, that strikes me as the most systematic problem and probably the most difficult one for him to deal with. Okay, so let's look at challenge number 1. Right, so the first challenge, you could put it sort of under the Stichwort monitoring invites persuasion, or risks persuasion, you might say. Right? So just to remind you of some features that we also heard from Axel's talk just now, Kant thinks that licensed acceptance of testimony requires being sensitive to the epistemically relevant qualities of testifiers. So, for example, he says, a clear-eyed belief is that which is connected with the examination of the witness and rests on it, but a blind belief is that which accepts a testimony without examination and investigation of its credibility. The former leads to the truth, the other is the path to error, therefore harmful, the former, however, useful. Right? And he also says credibility of witnesses involves competence, Tüchtigkeit, and integrity. Right? Now, I want to emphasize here that the problem that I'm raising right now is not that the examinations of witnesses by itself is incompatible with the presumptive principle. Right? And the reason for that is that we can allow for at least the possibility of monitoring, which is how contemporary epistemologists of testimony refer to this idea. The idea that we're not consciously checking the bona fides of testifiers, but that this is an unconscious process that goes on behind the scenes, and that it sort of alerts us to defeaters, right? So the idea would be, we're not consciously aware that this person is talking about a subject that they know nothing about, but we unconsciously recognize these signs, and that alerts us to the fact, and then it becomes conscious, right? Once it rises to the level of a defeater, right? So that's the idea. Again, this might not be in Kant. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt here that this could be a way that he would get out of this worry, right? So that's not the worry that I'm raising. The worry that I'm raising is this, right? So even if we characterize this sort of examination as monitoring, the sorts of reasons to which people actually attend in coming to accept another person's testimony are not, in fact, very good reasons, right? So the idea is that they are, in fact, instances of persuasion rather than of rational belief. And my own work on the epistemology of testimony is just the study of the epistemology of testimony. And in my own work, I've really highlighted these issues on credibility judgments and also competence judgments and so on. It's one of my Steckenpferde, as it were. But what I'm trying to do here is, within Kant, find the resources to make the argument that I've been making in my own work, namely that Kant already recognizes that this is a problem, right? That we're not very good at our competence judgments and our credibility judgments. If you look at Kant's description of the evaluation of competence, it actually sounds like persuasion rather than knowledge, right? So what Kant himself says is that we ought to assess whether the testimony has the benefit of the, quote, sufficient reputation of the witness, right? And he says, on the method by which we ought to gather evidence concerning that reputation, Kant suggests that a witness is credible if one can at least probably recognize from an educated manner that he has sufficient reputation, right? But drawing inferences from an educated manner sounds to me troublingly reminiscent of the prejudice of prestige of the person, and not good evidence for competence. Similarly, let's see if we can get this, yes. Kant's description of how we assess integrity is, in fact, by his own light, persuasion rather than knowledge. And here there's actually stronger evidence for this, right? So he says, when he talks about how we assess integrity, he says, this is a quote, if we are to put ourselves into somebody's hands, it is only natural that we first look him in the face, and particularly in the eyes, no matter how well recommended he comes to us. We want to find out what we have to be on guard against. His repelling or attractive gestures determine our choice, or also make us suspicious even before we have come to conclusions about his morals. Now, as a description of the psychology of how we evaluate testifiers, this is actually quite accurate. But if you look at the social psychology literature about how reliable this evidence is, it's abjectly horrible, right? So, for example, eye contact is not good evidence of truthfulness or reliability at all, right? So it's really terrible. And Kant, in some sense, is aware of this fact, right? So, for example, at least with the case of blushing, he notes himself that it's not a good indicator of a lack of integrity, right? People are too complex. We don't know why they're blushing. And he says, and this is a quote from him, whether it betrays consciousness of guilt, or rather a delicate sense of honor, or just a response to the imputation of something of which one would have to be ashamed, is quite uncertain in particular instances, right? And this goes back to the opacity of others. We're not very good at sort of seeing through them to see their motives, right? And what should we conclude from this if we're not good at seeing through them to see their motives? Well, he says, how diverse is the human will disposed? It is therefore better to completely abandon this belief if it does not have the attendant properties, if one cannot guess why people speak so and not otherwise. So this would suggest that believing on the basis of someone's testimony because we take them to be reliable, competent, and trustworthy testifiers is actually persuasion rather than objectively grounded belief if we cannot guess why people speak so and not otherwise, right? If we don't have good reasons for thinking why they speak so and not otherwise. And then, although he doesn't address these cases all that often, he does say that these difficulties are even more prevalent in cases of second-hand testimony, right? In those cases, he says, competence is impossible to determine, and it is not the best way to judge the integrity of a person whose character you otherwise do not know. All right, so that's the first problem, right? That it looks like even if you go the monitoring route, that these are going to be invitations for persuasion rather than for objectively well-grounded assent. Now, the second problem, and this actually attacks my own 2010 paper, right, where I do sort of appeal to social norms. It doesn't seem to me that social norms will help either, right? So this is something that Axel quotes in his 2006 paper, which seems to suggest that the way that we justify the presumptive principle is by appeal to an a priori norm, right? And so the idea here is that fidelity is always required in regard to him who promises something so that he keeps to what was promised. Belief, however, is required in regard to him to whom something is promised, namely so that he accepts as true that the other will keep his promise. The two must be combined with each other. It also indicates a very bad mode of thought if one never trusts anyone in anything, but instead one wants to see everything that is promised and pledged to him present and fulfilled, right? So this is talking about promising, the institution of promising, but Axel draws the connection to the institution of asserting and accepting assertions, right? And the idea here is that we ought to treat the institution of asserting and accepting assertions as parallel to the institution of promising, and that should be the idea for the justification of the presumptive principle. And I have something similar in my 2010 article. Okay, but the problem is I don't think that this appeal to norms will help. And here I'm actually going to give you an argument, so a nice structured argument, fun. All right, so here's the first premise. Social norms underwriting testimony are contingent, right? And here's an example of that. Not until the beginning of the previous cyclone, the previous era, did people realize that it is necessary to tell the whole truth, and everyone thus had to be wholly accurate in his reports, and if someone swerved from the truth only a little in his writings, then he would be shamed and dishonored, right? So the idea here is this norm of truth-telling is actually relatively recent, right? I think Kant is optimistic that there was a norm of truth-telling in his day, but even if we grant that, the point would be that it wasn't there for long, right? So that there have been wide swathes of human history where there was no norm of truth-telling. Second premise, any norm justifying the presumptive principle, however, must be a priori. So it looks like the conclusion is that social norms underwriting testimony cannot justify the presumptive principle. All right, that's challenge number 2. Challenge number 3. It looks to me like ruling out persuasion violates the presumptive principle, right? And now I'm going into the territory that it sounded like Alix and Andrew were pressing in their questions to Axel. So this is the case where if you think you have to actively rule out that someone is lying to you or that someone is not competent, that seems clearly to violate the presumptive principle, right? So that's this one. And again, I'm just giving you a structured argument here. So I apologize if you want more background on any of these premises. We can talk about them more in the Q&A, but I was trying to be efficient in my use of your time. So here's the first premise. The touchstone of whether taking something to be true is conviction or mere persuasion is therefore externally the possibility of communicating it and finding it to be valid for the reason of every human being to take it to be true, right? So we've talked about that, the communicability principle or the universalizability principle or whatever you want to call it. There we go. Second premise, in the case of testimony, what do we have to pay attention to? Well, as we saw before, without critical reasons in the appraisal of a testimony, we cannot trust a testifier. And if you remember, those critical reasons had to do with the competence of the testifier and with the integral moral character of the testifier, right? That they're honest. But critical reasons, that's from the second premise, right? About which it is possible for us to communicate, that's from the first premise, are incompatible with unconscious monitoring, right? That's the claim here. You actually have to, now you can't just unconsciously monitor things, you have to actually consciously say, aha, I know, if Sven pushes me on why did I trust Hatice, then I would say, well, Hatice is extremely competent and she is of great moral character, right? But I actually have to be able to come up with those reasons in justifying myself to Sven, right? But this means that licensed trust in testimony is incompatible with unconscious monitoring and therefore incompatible with the presumptive principle, right? Before, in that first challenge, right, we were able to appeal to unconscious monitoring and then we didn't have to worry about running afoul to the presumptive principle. But now that these facts have to be facts to which we can appeal in justifying ourselves to others, then we can no longer appeal to unconscious monitoring, and we now do directly run afoul of the presumptive principle. Okay, so this last one is, for me, I think the biggest systematic problem for the presumptive principle. And it seems to me that the problem here is that the presumptive principle actually entails that when you believe testimony, it's mere persuasion, and it could never rise to the level of knowledge. So again, I'm just giving you an argument here. And I'm presenting this all on one screen. Here you go, right? So the idea here is, on Kant's own view, the objective ground for a person's belief on the basis of testimony is based on the reliability of witnesses, right? That's what he says, right? So if you have objectively sufficient, objectively good grounds, then it's because the witnesses are both competent and of good moral character, right? But given that first premise, the presumptive principle cannot be the objective ground for someone's belief that P, right? But that means that if someone relies on the presumptive principle in coming to believe that P on the basis of testimony, then it isn't the case that there is some ground G such that G is both their sufficient objective ground and their sufficient subjective ground for assenting to P, right? Those come apart then. Right? So in the good case, if everything works as planned, then it would be the case, if you believe on the basis of the presumptive principle, that you could also have good objective grounds. The problem here is that your subjective grounds are the presumptive principle, and your objective grounds are the reliability, the competence, and the honesty of the testifier. Right? But that means that if someone relies on the presumptive principle in coming to believe that P on the basis of testimony, their belief that P is an instance of persuasion. Right? That was the very definition of persuasion, that we take our subjective grounds to be objective, incorrectly take our subjective grounds to be objective, and that's precisely this case. If we want to go into the details, there are more possibilities here, right? So if you look, before I raised these options, that we could be mistaken about our subjective grounds, right? So it's possible, of course, that we could think ourselves to be believing the testifier's testimony because we take them to be honest and competent and so on. But that would still raise a problem, right? Because then our actual subjective ground would still be the presumptive principle, and that's the thing that's incompatible with our actual objective grounds. Okay. So in conclusion, I just want to sort of review what I've done here, right? So again, 1 through 3 hopefully will not have been controversial, right? I'm relying on shared readings of Kant for 1 through 3. The controversial stuff presumably is going to be the 4 challenges that I raised for Kant. And although I would love to see a solution to these, I find it difficult. And then, again, let me just thank the organizers for a wonderful conference.
Great. So I want to join all the previous speakers in thanking the organizers for this beautiful conference and for having me. I also want to thank Joe for this fantastic paper. There's much in there that I fundamentally agree with and more things that I learned from Joe. I want to highlight one theme that came out in the previous talks as well, and why I find myself like in a very fundamental agreement, which is that there seems to be an inherent tension in Kant's account of testimony. That on the one hand, sometimes he seems to be very optimistic about the overall prospect of testimony, but then if one looks at his overall commitments, that really seems to put pressure on what testimony can achieve. And so this is like sort of, I take the upshot of the paper with which I fundamentally agree. But sort of for the sake of intellectual progress, I'll try to pursue those themes where we may disagree, but I think really those are just invitations for clarification maybe. Though I'm also afraid that perhaps the pressure goes a bit more against points 1 to 3 rather than 4, but sort of that may then also bear on the other challenges that you develop. So here's my structure. I'll first give a very quick summary of the main argument, and then I'm going to raise 3 questions which will relate to 3 worries or concerns one might have. So here's the summary and the overview. So Joe takes as his point of departure Alex Galfred's seminal 4-fold characterization of empirical testimony in Kant. So there seem to be these 4 features, namely that it is inalienable, that it establishes empirical knowledge with certainty, that it is as good as first-hand experience, so we get that symmetry claim, and that it can be accepted based on a presumptive principle, as you called it. Now, if I understand Joe right, he's largely happy about the first 3 points. And I mean, he cited some evidence in support, but the real target here is the presumptive principle, which he tries to surgically remove with his C-section, as you called it. And so, yeah, so there is an implicit assumption that they're logically distinct. I agree with that. There's a question then whether ultimately the other 3 points remain untouched. So here's what I take to be the main claim, just as a gloss. So the idea is Kant cannot have endorsed the presumptive principle, or better, there is some pressure on Kant endorsing the presumptive principle about empirical testimony, because he thought that persuasion, dissimulation, and prejudice are pervasive. They prevail, and so such cognitive malfunctions not only undermine the reliability of the testifier, but also of the receiver of the testimony. And that then puts the pressure on the presumptive principle, and you articulated this really well in these 4 challenges. Okay, now, so turning to the first question, and this is like a very basic question, it's like, what is the presumptive principle for Kant? And now I regret not putting this on the handout, but it was already cited like a gazillion times in previous talks. There is this passage from the Blomberg lecture where Kant articulates this presumptive principle. And the way he articulates this is that we can assume as a default that the testifiers are sincere and upright, I think is how it's translated. Importantly, that's a default about the character of the testifier. That's not a default about like whether I can accept what the testifier says, but I think there is sort of the salient bridging principle, which is if I take the testifier to be sincere and upright, then I'm also justified in accepting what the testifier says. And so this then brings me to what I take to be implicitly the presumptive principle that Joe relied on, but please feel free to correct me on this if this is not the one you had in mind, but that would align with the anti-reductivism that one finds in the literature roughly. So the idea would be, well, S is justified in believing that P, if, so we get a sufficient condition here, T testifies to S that P, and then here comes the presumptive idea, S has no undefeated defeatist, indicating that T is unreliable, and then because we only want this for empirical testimony, P is an empirical proposition. So something like that in the literature is sometimes put in terms of a right to accept. I want to go with the belief justified in believing because I think it's also a locution that appeared several times in the talk. And now for me the main question just really is what in Kant's epistemology corresponds to justified belief. And I really don't think this is trivial. So one worry may already be like just belief with a small b. One could say, well, the salient candidate is assent. I think Andrew has done some great work to show that our notion of belief doesn't really align with what Kant says about assent, but that's not a line I'm going to pursue. What I'm more interested in is just like outright belief. And so it seems that the one you had in mind was sort of the belief that if one would also have the truth of the assent, would yield knowledge. So that's also what we got in the paper. And what I just want to focus on is the idea that where we have sufficient objective grounds of assent. So the idea would be outright belief in Kant requires, so outright justification in Kant requires sufficient objective grounds, and that's the justification that we plug into the presumptive principle. Now here's the worry, which is that sufficient objective grounds for Kant entails certainty, and most people would think that certainty entails truth. So this is a very, very high bar of justification. And so the concern is, if that is the justification we care about in the presumptive principle, then that the presumptive principle would in some sense become trivially false. So obviously we shouldn't just take anyone's word if our justification then would have to interrogate the truth of the proposition. And in a way then, I mean, so I would agree with you that the presumptive principle is false, but one wouldn't have to go through all the hassle of showing that sort of persuasion isn't that pervasive, because all that one had to show would be to say, well, persuasion, at least false persuasion, is possible, and that would perhaps then suffice to undermine that principle. Now, there is sort of a strategy to get around this, and so here I'm going to get to my favorite slide. So one would not have to be an infallibilist about sufficient objective grounds. So Kant has this idea that evidential justification comes in different strengths, and the strength depends on the objective grounds and can be measured by how probable the objective grounds render the assent in question. And so on the standard infallibilist picture, which is commonly associated with Lawrence Pasternak, sort of we would say, okay, everything above 0.52 excluding 1 gives opinion, and that's sort of insufficient objective grounds. And then we have only at like 100% probability we get like sufficient objective grounds. But Andrew has like made this falsification. Again, have a nice picture. Then one could also read Kant differently. So, but there's a question. I had the impression that you may want to be fallibilist about sufficient objective grounds, also because you had a truth condition in the definition of knowledge. I just want to flag that this would come with a substantive commitment, and that we think the proposition can be certain, yet so the justification can render a proposition certain, yet the proposition can be false. So that's just something to bear in mind for that not to be for the presumptive principle not to be sort of trivially false. Now, but there's another candidate for the justification one could be going for here, namely the threshold for opinion. So there would be justified opinion, or as one could also render justified assent. But there, so here's a way to render this, it doesn't really matter too much. The idea would just be, well, the grounds make it more probable than not that the proposition is true. And here then it would seem that even if persuasion was pervasive, that if you plug that into the presumptive principle, that it may still remain truly plausible. So all it says is that testimony, all other things being equal, so would speak in favor of the proposition, just nudge the probability slightly upwards. So that then brings me to the first concern, which is
just a total clarification. So you're using believing and assenting in these principles.
Oh, sorry, yeah, that's probably because I wrote this at 3 a.m.
So they mean the same thing here.
Yeah, so because I wanted to, they should be in the same thing because I want this to be plugged into the presumptive principle, which is specified in terms of belief. But that's okay. But yeah, there should be in the same thing, small b. But as I mentioned, that's not trivial. So that's the first concern. So if we go with a very strong notion of justification, it just seems that the presumptive principle seems to be trivially false. And if we go with a weaker notion of justification, it seems like, yeah, even if there was a lot of persuasion, that may not face that principle. Okay, so that gets me to my second question, just how pervasive and also malicious is persuasion? So the example you use for dissolution, I think is the term, is very normatively loaded. So we have like talking about government, religion, and so forth, and might use harm to him. And so there is this idea, the cases that you mentioned also in the case of persuasion with the Triebfeder, there's sort of all sorts of wishes, desires, interests, which is the perfect breeding ground for persuasion. But then if we look sort of at the examples Kant gives of empirical testimony, the very fact of the matter, so the death of a great man, that Rome exists, that Madrid is the capital of Spain, that there is America, and now one could imagine that one is persuaded about these things, but there's a question of like, how pervasive is this really? And I mean, one thing I want to note is that perhaps that only affects the sort of persuasion on the side of the testifier. Maybe your first challenge still holds. I'm not entirely sure about this because, I mean, the case we said like looking them in the eye, so that, I mean, even if they're telling you that Rome exists, that may still apply. And I also want to note the passage you cited from Yeshe, sort of page 73, where he says like most people remain with persuasion, only few make it to conviction. I read the passage as take the subset of those people who have persuasion right now, and sort of how many of those would be able to get to conviction. But that doesn't say how prevalent that subset of people with persuasion is in the first case. So that's how I read the Yeshe passage, that need not establish the pervasiveness of persuasion. Okay, but then there's also a question, just like how malicious is persuasion? How epistemically bad is it? So, and here, so there are different ways to define persuasion. There's just some gloss. Kant thinks, well, we are persuaded if we mistakenly think that we have sufficient objective grounds. That is, we don't really have sufficient objective grounds, but we think we have them. And he says, that we confuse subjective grounds for objective ones. And now I think that this account is consistent with cases of assent, where we really have strong objective grounds, which may render the assent like 0.7 probable, but where we then, because we have an interest in the matter, think we are at full knowledge, 100% probability. And so that may be a case of persuasion, but where we would say, yeah, well, the testifier is a bit confused about just how strong their grounds are. But so if that kind of persuasion was pervasive, where we just usually overestimate how good our grounds are, I'm not sure whether that is so problematic. So I think on top of showing that persuasion is pervasive, one would also have to show that that persuasion, which is pervasive, is also malicious. And I mean, I think it's empirically plausible that perhaps that is the case, and then sort of the question would be, I think especially the first two challenges you put as empirical challenges to some extent, so is there like an empirical assumption, like if more than half of all assents are persuaded, then this is bad, like, or is the threshold lower? So again, in some sense, just an invitation to clarify this a bit more. And then just have a look at the time, still get some time, I think. So yeah, there's a question, the second concern, how pervasive is it in conversations? Okay, so now I want to get to the third concern, just like, was Kant a skeptic about testimony? And so here, the way you set this up is that, well, he cannot have been an anti-reductionist, given that he, like everything he says, undermines the presumptive principle. But especially in the presentation of the fourth challenge, it also sounded as though pervasive persuasion would undermine the reductionist account. So maybe I'm misreading the passage, so that's what I thought would be the skeptical passage. Suppose that T is in fact reliable, honest testifier. T attests to S that P. Kant holds that S has insufficient evidence, however, as to whether T is reliable and honest. Therefore, S must rely on the presumptive principle. And then you say, but that also can't be the case. So I thought that there was this distinction, well, either he's a reductionist or he's an anti-reductionist, but if persuasion is pervasive, then both cases don't really yield knowledge. So that I thought like may give rise to sort of a skeptical argument I put on the handout, but so that's the idea of that argument. And so then the worry would be that sort of the 4 points you had from Axel, you don't just surgically remove the presumptivist principle, but at the same time you also damage sort of Kant's optimism about the possibility of testimonial knowledge.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are sort of several strategies one could employ to get around this. Maybe I'm misrepresenting what you were saying there. You're actually very optimistic about us being able to establish the reliability of the testifier. But then there's the question, like, if one was an infallibilist, that's anyways very, very difficult. But so maybe you are not an infallibilist. Yeah, so that's my third concern. And with that, I want to thank you.
Yes. Thank you. So I'm just hearing Chris's comments, but they're excellent. So thank you very much, Chris. I'm not going to waste a lot of time talking about them, but I would like to highlight something. And then we can hopefully have plenty of time for questions and stuff. So actually only the first claim is empirical. Oh, well, purely empirical. And maybe I'll put it this way. The only one that's affected by the prevalence of persuasion is actually the first challenge. And as I said, that's the weakest one. So if we had to get rid of it, it wouldn't be the end of the world for me, right? I was trying to avoid having to do too much Kant exegesis. How much persuasion does Kant think is out there? How much assimilation and so forth? He's pretty pessimistic about our current state, or maybe I was too influenced by Wood's 1991 paper, and I was reading him as quite pessimistic about our current state. But even if you grant that, I think for me the important one is that the challenges numbers 2 through 4 survive this work. Right? This issue about the prevalence of persuasion doesn't really affect those. And in particular, what I want to point out is that Chris's distinction between weak justification and strong justification is actually irrelevant to challenge 4, right? Because the problem for challenge 4 isn't the G makes more probable than not part of Chris's suggestion, right? If you look on page 2 of Chris's handout. It's actually Roman numeral 1 under weak justification, right? Which is G is S's objective and subjective ground for asserting that for assenting to P, right? That is what is going to be destroyed by the presumptive principle according to challenge 4, right? So even if you opt for weak justification, the challenge still remains. So the third problem was, again, how persuasive. The maliciousness is actually irrelevant, right? It doesn't really matter. And I think one of the points that Chris brought up briefly in his comments, and that is something that I think I need to highlight more in the actual paper, is that persuasion is a challenge on 2 fronts, right? It's a challenge for the recipient of the testimony. How do I ensure that I am not being persuaded? It's also a challenge because I also need to worry about whether the testifier is a victim themselves of persuasion rather than objective and subjective grounds that line up in the appropriate way, right? So, and there would be no way for me to know that if they're otherwise competent and honest, right? But they're a victim of persuasion in this case, I would have no way of ascertaining that. And then the question, was Kant a skeptic about testimony? I like the line about the surgical removal through the C-section. I actually, I was trying to raise a problem here for Kant. My view is completely different. I'm an externalist, and my own view is that testimony is actually a good source of knowledge because I think that we are embedded in socially distributed cognitive systems that are reliable purveyors of information, basically, just as a nutshell. And that survives any of these worries. So I think that we're bad at assessing interpersonal competence and so on, but we're lucky that we're embedded in networks that are good at only feeding us information from people who are actually reliable. So that's the picture. But yeah, so was Kant a skeptic about testimony? I agree that this puts pressure on Kant. It doesn't put it on me. So yeah. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.